Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Holidays of DevOps. And we started this phase 5 of this journey yesterday, where we talked about introduction to infrastructure as code, basically, where we talked about what infrastructure as code has come to achieve, and then we talked about different tools that can be used for infrastructure as code. Then we also said we are going to focus on Terraform for this particular phase of our journey. And today we are going to look at, we'll get an introduction to Terraform. I don't want to spend so much talking theoretically. I just want us to get the basic foundations, yes, to get the foundation, to get the fundamentals right before we start deploying things, so that we have a clear understanding of what we want to do and what we want to achieve before we go into the terminal and start doing stuff. So today we are going to look at Terraform, and we'll be looking at Terraform under these various subheadings. We are going to look at introduction to Terraform. We'll look at installing Terraform on our PC. We'll look at what we call Terraform Providers, because I mentioned it yesterday. We'll look at Terraform file format. We'll look at Terraform file structure, and then we'll look at Terraform Lifecycle. So um, without wasting further time, let's look at what Terraform is. So we'll go to Terraform documentation. Terraform was designed by a company called HashiCorp. HashiCorp is the company in charge of Terraform. Though currently HashiCorp is part of IBM, but HashiCorp is the company responsible for Terraform. So, and if we look here, they said, what is Terraform? Terraform is an infrastructure as code tool that lets you build, change, and version infrastructure safely and efficiently. So, let's click on Learn More. Let's see what we have. So, HashiCorp Terraform, like I said, is an infrastructure as code tool that lets you define both cloud and on-prem resource in a human readable configuration file that you can version, reuse, and share. I mentioned it yesterday that the difference between ARM templates, AWS Cloud Formation is because those are actually peculiar to those cloud providers. But Terraform can work with different cloud and even on-prem. So Terraform works with different cloud platforms. Terraform can also work with um, you know, on-prem. And how does it actually do that? So it creates and manages resources on cloud platform and other blah 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 through their APIs. Yes, through their APIs. So if we come back to PowerPoint here, and I'm going to go back to Azure. So I said one of the ways is through APIs. So we are focusing on the API aspect of deploying resources, and that's why we are looking at Terraform. So Terraform does things on cloud providers and on-prem using their APIs. So the provider enables Terraform to work with virtually any platform. That's why I made mention of Terraform providers yesterday. So how it works is that you write your Terraform file, you define what provider you want to use. If it is Azure, you use the Azure RM provider. If it is AWS, you use the AWS provider. With the GCP, you use the GCP provider. And then that will target that particular provider and create the resource on the platform. So that is basically a simple overview of how Terraform works. It's as simple as that. You declare what you want, you define what you want in your Terraform file. Terraform interacts with the provider, and then your resource is created. It is as simple as that. That is basically an overview of um of Terraform. So you can come to the Terraform documentation, and you can read all of these, why Terraform, manage any infrastructure, track infrastructure, automate changes, standardize configuration, and collaboration, and all of the rest. So now that we have an overview of what Terraform is, let's at least do something today. Let's do something on our timeline. So, and for this particular phase of our journey, we'll be working with VS Code. So everything we are going to do will be on VS Code. So this is my VS Code, and I can do Terraform. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 13 14 15 16 17 18 19 20 21 22 23 24 25 26 27 28 29 30 31 32 33 34 35 36 37 38 39 40 41 42 43 44 45 46 47 48 49 50 51 52 53 54 55 56 57 58 59 60 61 62 63 64 65 66 67 68 69 70 71 72 73 74 75 76 77 78 79 80 81 82 83 84 85 86 87 88 89 90 91 92 93 94 95 96 97 98 99 100 101 102 103 104 105 106 107 108 109 110 111 112 113 114 115 116 117 118 119 120 121 122 123 124 125 126 127 128 129 130 131 132 133 134 135 136 137 138 139 140 141 142 143 144 145 146 147 148 149 150 151 152 153 154 155 1 Terraform -v. And so I have Terraform installed, but am seeing that my version is out of date. So I would try and see if I can install Terraform also, so that I can also show how Terraform is being installed. So if we go back to our documentation, I always say this: the best way for you to make an installation or for you to use any tool is to go to the tools documentation pages, because that is where you can get the latest information about that tool on how to work with that tool. So click on install. So you can install, if you're using Mac OS, you can do this. If you're using Windows, you can download the Windows binary. If you're using Linux, you can use for, there's different installation for different flavors. We have the Ubuntu, we have CentOS, or where we have Fedora 41, Fedora 42, Amazon Linux, and this. So I'm using Ubuntu or Debian. So I'm just going to copy this. I'll copy this. There are other Linux you can install. So if you're using any of these, feel free to install them. So I would come to my VS Code and I'll just paste. So if you want to install Terraform and you've not installed it before, all you need to do is just copy this and install Terraform. And Terraform is going to be installed on your device, and then you can start doing things with Terraform. So it's as simple as that. So um, I'm going to wait for this to actually install. Okay. So let me stop this. Password is required. So yeah, let me cancel it. Let me do it one after the other, because I'm supposed to input my password. Supposed to input my password. Let me copy. File already exists. Yes, let me overwrite it. Let me overwrite it. Okay, so let me do the second one. Okay, and let's install Terraform. Okay, so we are currently installing Terraform. So you can copy everything at once. I think I made a mistake in my own. So just copy everything at once that you have there. When it asks you to input your password, you just input the password. So while we wait for that, so that we don't waste time, we'll move to what is next. So that's just how to install Terraform. Basically, you go to the Terraform documentation, you pick your operating system that you're using, you copy the command. If you're using Linux, I want to believe you're using Linux. But if you're using Windows, you download for Windows. If you're using Mac, you also install for Mac. So if you have any issues or any challenges installing Terraform, you can always drop a comment and we can look into it together and try and resolve it. So what we're going to look at next is Terraform providers. Just like I've been mentioning since yesterday. Basically, what providers do is that providers help you to talk to the different cloud providers, right? So for this particular phase, we'll be working with Azure. So and the provider we are going to work with is AzureRM, that's Azure Resource Management. That's the provider we are going to work with. So providers in a nutshell, they help you to talk to those different cloud providers or on-prem provider and the like. So I want to check my installation. I want to actually make mention of something. So, okay. So Terraform has been successfully installed. So let me check Terraform -v. Let's see what version is installed. So now we have the version 1.14.8. So remember the last time when I did Terraform -v, I was getting a notification that I'm supposed to install the latest version. Let me see if I can go up if it's still there. Okay, so I had 1.12.2, right? And they said your version is out of date, and I should install the latest version, which is 1.14.8. So it is not actually compulsory, but just for the sake of this particular video, I had to do the installation again so that you see how it works. So now there's something called Terraform version and there's something called the provider version. Terraform version and provider version, they are not the same thing. Let me show you what I mean. Before now, I have a snippet of, yes. So I'm going to look at this small code snippet of what the Terraform provider is. So this is the provider configuration for Terraform, and we are seeing Terraform, and then we are seeing required version. This required version, when we start working on, when we start doing things, when we start writing our Terraform file, we'll understand this better. So now this is the Terraform version. This is Terraform version 1.3.1. That is the required version for Terraform for it to work. Now, we can now see required providers. So you're working with, this is where you define the provider that you want to work with. For this, we are working with Azure RM, like I said. Since we're using Azure, we use Azure RM. And it is developed by HashiCorp themselves in collaboration with Azure. And this is version. We have required version, which is for Terraform, and then we have the version for the provider. So you will notice that you're seeing some symbols. You're seeing greater than or equal to. You're seeing tilde and greater than sign. So I'm just going to quickly talk about that, though it's not part of what we're supposed to talk about. But then, since we are currently talking about the providers, it is just nice I talk about this. So we have So we have greater than or equal to. We have we have this, we have this, and we have this. We have also the other ones that we have. We have this. We have obviously we have equal to, right? So all of these they're just normal how do I put it now? What is it called again? In science or mathematical expressions. Basically, if we have 1.2.0, it means you can use any version that is equal to this version or higher than that. So you can have 1.3.0, 1.4.0, you can have it. So that's basically what greater than or equal to is. If you have not equal to, that means let's say you have 1.2.0. So you can use any version except this particular version. So we are going to use a version that is not this particular version, but any other version that you want to use is acceptable, right? Is acceptable except 1.2.0. So equal to is actually self-explanatory. We want this exact version. We want the exact 1.2.0. That's then lastly, this is one of the most tricky one, or maybe it's not that self-explanatory. So if you have 1.2.0, it means that you are only allowed to modify this last part of the version, that's the zero. So what I mean is that you can have 1.2.1, 1.2.3 to 1.2.3, 1.2.4 down to 1.2 point anything. But these first two parts must remain constant. It must remain constant. So you cannot have 1.3.4. So it has to be 1.2. But this last value can change, right? But let's say if you have just maybe 1.2. So this last value can change, but any one before it cannot change. Basically, that's what it means. And now, you might be wondering, okay, why am I talking about the version? In Terraform, version is very, very important because if you use a different version from what was used to develop your application, you might have issues in production. The code might break, something may happen to your infrastructure, and all of that. So, version is very, very, very important when you're writing your Terraform file. So, I just wanted to talk about that on the side. When we start writing all of these things, practically, you will understand better and you will be able to understand the importance of including a version when you're defining your infrastructure as code. So, Terraform file format. So, basically, Terraform has an extension of .tf. So, the file format of Terraform is .tf. So, you can have providers.tf, main.tf, output.tf. So, it is tf. That is the file format. And now let's talk about Terraform file structure. So, basically, on a high level, on a high level, this is the way Terraform file structure is. You have main.tf, you have variables.tf, and you have outputs.tf. So you have these are actually a small letter. It's just changing this to capital letter. So you have main.tf, variables.tf, outputs.tf. But I'm going to include some other things. But I said on a high level, you have these three: main.tf, variables.tf, output.tf. I'm going to include some other things that makes sorry, that makes your code much more, much more better. Yes, that's the word. It makes it more because we don't want to define everything in our main.tf. So we have something like providers.tf. I'm going to explain what all of this different file does. We have provider.tf. We have what else do we have? We have Terraform.tf So um like I said, on a high level we have these three, but I've also included providers.tf and terraform.tfvars. So now I'm going to explain all of these one after the other. Your main.tf is the main entry point. Is self-explanatory. That is where you define your main infrastructure. So your main infrastructure goes into the main.tf. The variables.tf is also self-explanatory, where you define your variables. What variables do you want? And we all know what variables mean. We've been saying variables from the very first phase of this particular journey. What are variables and all of that? So output.tf, basically it is when you run your Terraform script. Now, what are the things you want to see? You might say, okay, it's you want it to display the IP address, or you want it to display the name of the VM. So it's just basically you define what you want it to display, right? So that's what outputs.tf actually means. For providers.tf is where you define which providers you want to use. If you want to use um, Azure, which is AzureRM, if you want to use AWS, if you want to use GCP, you can define it in your providers.tf. What you define in your providers.tf can also be in your main.tf, but to make the code much more better to manage, it is better to have a separate file for providers.tf so that you don't move, you not um squeeze everything in main.tf and makes the file very, very difficult for you to manage. Now we have the last one, which is terraform.tfvrs. So now It's also for variables, but the difference between this and then variables.tf is variables.tf basically defines what variable you will use, right? It defines what variables you want to use. However, Terraform.tf defines what value that variable is going to be. Let's say, for example, you define a variable called location, because location can actually be a variable. So you don't want to have code in certain location in your main.tf. So you define a variable called location. Now, what location, the location you actually use, that's the value for that location, would be in your terraform.tf VARs. If you want to use, let's say, East US is your location, you don't define that East US location in your Terraform, in your variables.tf. Your variables.tf is only used to define a variable. The value, the main value itself is in terraform.tf VR. So that's the difference between Terraform variables.tf and terraform.tf variable. So it's just like, let's say, for example, you're filling a form. The form itself is variables.tf. The value that you input in that form is the terraform.tf variable, VARs. So that's the difference between those two. So on a high level, this is how your Terraform file is supposed to be structured, right? And then finally, we look at Terraform Lifecycle. So Terraform Lifecycle basically is divided into three, though there are other things in between. But on a high level, it is divided into three. So we have the first is Terraform init, Terraform plan, and we have Terraform apply. Okay, we have Terraform init, Terraform plan, Terraform apply. And basically, this is most of the time, this is what you're going to be doing. The Terraform init stage means that you want to initialize Terraform to work on the file that you have defined. That's basically what the Terraform init means. You are initializing Terraform to, prepping it um, to work. Terraform plan is Terraform has done something where before you before you apply a particular code to your provider, there's a way you can see the output. It's like a it's like a dry run. Yes, that's the word. It's like a dry run. You can see the output of what you have defined before you apply it. So Terraform plan is just like that dry run that you carry out. When you carry out Terraform plan, you see exactly how it will be. So you see the outcome, you see what will happen, but you are not actually applying it to the environment. You're just saying how it is going to be when you apply. So when you see it and you're okay with what you're saying, then you can now go to Terraform apply. One more thing, the life cycle is not complete if you don't have Terraform destroy. Yes, so you can also the last is Terraform destroy. Once you're done, you can use a single command to bring down an entire environment. So once you just use Terraform destroy, Terraform destroy brings down the environment. So it starts at the Terraform init and it ends at Terraform destroy. So that is the high level of Terraform life cycle. So I hope you've been able to, gain one or two from this particular video. I hope you've been able to install Terraform because from tomorrow we'll start, using Terraform to deploy one or two things on our Azure account. So that'll be all from me today. I'll see you on the next episode tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.